Welcome to Peak Rail Country. Many people will be familiar with this famous view, looking down from Monsell Head to the valley and viaduct below. The railway which once crossed the viaduct was the former Midland Main Line, which linked London with Derby and Manchester, traversing some of the most spectacular scenery in the Peak District. In 1967, the section of the line from Matlock to Buxton was closed. All the track had been lifted, with the exception of the last 4 miles into Buxton. It is the 20 miles between these two well-known Derbyshire towns that Peak Rail plc is planning to reopen. Come with us now on a journey northwards from Matlock, where the presently used British Rail line from Derby terminates. Matlock will be the southern terminus of the Peak Rail line. This view, from high above the town, shows the station surrounded by the magnificent scenery of this part of Derbyshire. The famous High Tor is in the left-hand side of the picture. The route of the railway follows the valley of the River Derwent. This shows part of the village of Darley-Dale, which grew up around the stone quarries and the railway. A few miles further north at Roseley, a large loco depot existed alongside the river. Nothing remains of this, but the route of the main line is clearly visible. Behind the old village of Roseley, this viaduct spans the Derwent. At this point, the railway is very near to one of England's most famous stately homes, Chatsworth. Home of the Duke of Devonshire and known as the Palace of the Peak, the house and grounds are a magnet for visitors. After Roseley, the railway leaves the River Derwent to follow the valley of the Wye, soon plunging into a tunnel under the grounds of another historic house, Haddon Hall. This is one of the finest examples of a medieval house in the country. Owned by the Rutland family, it was a former duke who insisted that the railway be buried in a tunnel under the grounds so that it could not be seen from the house. Further on, at Coombs Lane Viaduct, the railway enters the Peak District National Park. This marks the southern end of the Monsell Trail, a footpath established by the Peak Park along the trackbed of the railway. The next landmark is Bakewell. A passenger on the line would get this view when approaching from the south. It is a very interesting place. There has been a bridge over the River Wye at this point since 1300. The famous Bakewell pudding originated at the Rutland Arms Hotel in the town. Continuing our northward journey, in high summer we can see how nature has taken over along the track. There is a profusion of wildflowers everywhere, as seen in this deep cutting approaching Headstone Tunnel. At the other end of the tunnel, the railway bursts out over the famous Monsell Viaduct. Let us return to the map for a moment and look closer at the route northwards from this point. The line followed the river through Millersdale and Cheadale to the triangular Peak Forest Junction, where the main line to Manchester curved away to the north and the branch line to Buxton proceeded northwesterly through Ashwood Dale. It is on the section from Buxton to Blackwall Mill and round the corner into Great Roxdale that the track is still in place and used for stone traffic. Upstream from Monsell Dale, the River Wye is contained in a series of limestone gorges, the first having the lovely name of Watercombe-Jollydale. The tranquil water in the mill dam provides a perfect mirror for the ramblers on the riverside path. But where is the railway? What a challenge faced the Victorian engineers who built the line. The route took it along ledges high above the valley, giving breathtaking glimpses of the river below before plunging into one of the many short tunnels along this section. At Millersdale, the river is crossed again by two impressive viaducts leading into the station. Originally there was only one bridge, the second one being built 40 years later as traffic increased. The station was quite extensive considering the small community it served, having 5 platforms and a subway. Sadly, most of the buildings have disappeared. The ones left are used as a ranger post for the Monsell Trail. Next comes Deep Cheedale, so narrow in places that there is barely room for the river, so the railway had to dive through 3 tunnels, then scrambled for a foothold along the valley side for almost a quarter of a mile, as seen in the right-hand side of this picture. The best place to see the triangular junction is from the lay-by on the A6 road above Taddington. This excellent view shows the route of the Manchester line coming in from the right, the presently used line coming in from the left, then joining together to travel up Great Roxdale, passing the huge quarry at Tunstead, said to have the longest quarry face in Europe. Further along the track towards Buxton is the site of the smallest station in Britain, called Blackwall Mill. It served the railway cottages in the Dale Bottom and the hamlet of Blackwall Mill on the hillside above. It possessed 2 minute platforms, barely long enough to accommodate a single carriage. Ashwood Dale is another deep limestone valley, where railway, river and road keep close company. The line crosses the river 6 times between Blackwall Mill and Buxton. And so to Buxton, a famous spa town founded by the Romans, stands at just over 1,000 feet above sea level and surrounded by even higher hills, giving views like this over the town. From 1780 onwards, through the efforts of 3 successive Dukes of Devonshire, Buxton became established as a spa second only to Bath. The sweeping crescent was built close to St Anne's Well, where the famous mineral water gushes to the surface. In 1863, 2 railway companies, the Midland and the London and North Western, brought their lines to the town within a few days of each other. The Duke of Devonshire, being the biggest landowner in the town, insisted that they build identical stations side by side. Known as the Twin Sisters, each possessed a handsome facade with a giant fan window. Sadly, the Midland building has now gone, but the other remains, a reminder of the great age of railway building. This brings us to a suitable moment to look at the history of the Matlock to Buxton line. Starting as the little railway with the long name, the Manchester, Buxton, Matlock and Midland Junction Railway constructed the section from Ambergate to Roseley, and this was opened in 1849. This shot shows a train travelling south from Darley-Dale towards Matlock. Here are a few more pictures of the line in operation. The station at Darley-Dale. And the signal box. This shot shows the northbound Midland Pullman passing through Darley-Dale. This was a prestige express service between Manchester and London and operated from 1959 until 1966. And this was Matlock Station in its heyday. the time the next stage from Roseley was constructed, the little railway had amalgamated with the Midland, which had always had ambitions for a line to Manchester. Because of opposition from the Rutland family, the line had to be tunnelled under the Haddon estate. The Rutlands used Bakewell Station when travelling. This resulted in a far grander building than would otherwise have been constructed. The Dukes of Devonshire had a small station built at Hassop to serve Chatsworth, and this station at Great Longston served the nearby Thornbridge Hall. The sight of a train crossing the Monsell Viaduct must have been very impressive. In the not too distant future, Peak Rail will make it happen again. As mentioned earlier, Millersdale Station was large with 5 platforms. Passengers changed here from the main line onto the branch line service to Buxton. At one time, there were a few through coaches from London to Buxton. The Midland Line reached Buxton in 1863, and the station was closed by British Rail in 1967. 104 years of interesting history. But this is by no means the end of the story. We have seen the line in its present state and in its heyday. To get an idea of why a private railway company should be so interested in restoring this route, we have to look at its potential. From the map, we can see that the area served by the line is within easy travelling distance of several large conurbations, thus giving it a greater number of potential passengers than almost any other preserved railway in the UK. 16 million people live within 50 miles. Another major factor giving the company confidence is the great scenic value of the countryside through which the line runs. This, combined with major tourist venues such as Chatsworth, Matlock Bath, complete with cable car, Bakewell, and Buxton, have made the area a mecca for tourists. As stated earlier, part of the track bed within the Peak Park has been made into a walking trail. Fencing will be erected to separate trains from walkers, and it is expected that the closeness of the line to the public will serve to enhance its appeal. We have looked at past and present, but what of the future? Peak Rail has already made considerable progress since its inception in 1975. Compare this shot of Darley-Dale Station in 1991 with that of 10 years earlier in 1981, before any restoration work had been done. The first restoration work undertaken by the company was at Matlock, where the lease of the station buildings was acquired in 1978. Although by no means derelict, considerable work was needed to adapt them for our requirements. This shot was taken in early 1979. New toilet facilities were made. An early venture was the opening of the shop, which brought in much needed revenue, and also gave us the opportunity to meet the public and make them aware of the project. A tea room named the Paxton Buffet was opened in the spring of 1981. In the same year, Peak Rail, in a joint venture with British Rail, operated Sunday trains between Derby and Matlock. BR provided driver and guard, while Peak Rail volunteers acted as conductors and operated an on-train buffet. This proved to be a very valuable public relations exercise, as well as generating income for the company. The base at Matlock quietly carried on flying the Peak Rail flag at the southern end. In 1986, a Metrovic Kobo diesel arrived for restoration, followed in 1987 by a Peak class, Penny Ghent. In 1988, the Paxton Buffet was enlarged to meet increased demand. Another large diesel loco, D100 Sherwood Forester, arrived to join the other two. In 1989, the interior of the shop was refurbished with new shelves and fittings. We will now take a leap of 20 miles to the northern end of the line at Buxton. In February 1980, the site of the old Midland station looked like this, the only remaining building being the goods shed. The rest was a wilderness. Keeping the building in our sights, we move the viewpoint backwards, but go forwards in time to April 1983. The site has been cleared, track has been laid, and the building renovated. Moving forward in time again to December 1984, we see a living, working steam centre. The climax of 4 years' hard work came at Easter 1984, when we were able to offer steam rides to the public for the first time. (1985) saw 3 very important events. Firstly, Peak Rail was chosen as a subject for the BBC TV Open Space programme. This shot shows the film crew at work at Buxton. Secondly, again in conjunction with British Rail, Peak Rail operated a train service called the Rambler. It used DMUs chartered from BR. The route along BR lines normally used for freight travelled from Buxton, down Ashwooddale, up Great Roxdale, through Doveholes Tunnel and on to New Mills. And finally, at the end of 1985, Peak Rail was very honoured when His Grace the Duke of Devonshire agreed to become its patron. At the time, the Duke said, "I would dearly like to see the reinstatement of the whole 20 miles of railway between Buxton and Matlock during my lifetime." The Buxton Steam Centre was the focal point of Peak Rail activities for the next 4 years, during which time many people took steam rides, toured the site and visited the engine shed, taking great interest in all the work going on. The activities at Buxton and Matlock, as well as being a good source of revenue for the company, also served to put the project in the public eye, and in particular gave credibility with local authorities. As a result, in 1987, Peak Rail at last got the good news it had been waiting for 12 years to hear, that the authorities concerned had accepted the 15-year plan for the reconstruction of the whole route. At this point, let us look in more detail at Peak Rail, the company. The Peak Rail Society was formed in 1975, followed by Peak Rail Operations Limited 2 years later. At the end of 1986, these two were merged to become Peak Rail plc. One thing more than any other that has kept up the momentum of the project is, of course, people. The volunteers who give up their spare time doing the many varied jobs available, all the year round and in all weathers. Firstly, there is the restoration of locos, rolling stock and buildings. and track laying and maintenance. Not all jobs involve heavy work. Our shops need staffing. Here, our lady members make valuable contributions. The task of dispatching our quarterly magazine, Steaming the Peak, requires intense activity over a short period. Fundraising is of prime importance. Members go out to local events with sale stands, and once again, this brings the project into the public eye. Another revenue earner is our annual prize draw. In 1986, the winning ticket was drawn by TV personality and steam enthusiast Fred Dibner. Following the good news of 1987, a lot of money was needed to start developing the line outside Buxton. To this end, in October 1988, Peak Rail announced a share issue. The Duke of Devonshire was invited to launch it and also name a locomotive the Duke. He is seen here alongside the loco with the chairman of Peak Rail, John Snell, and local civic dignitaries. The share issue aimed to raise £250,000. The primary target of £30,000 had to be achieved in 40 days for the issue to continue. This figure was reached in an incredible 7 days, and by the end of June 1989 it stood at 192,000. From 1988, the focal point for Peak Rail activities moved to Darley-Dale. But this was not the beginning of the company's presence there. Work had been quietly going on since early 1982. This building on the east platform before any work commenced. A daunting task faced the small band of workers who reported for duty on alternate Sundays over the next few years. This and the following 2 slides will show the state of the interior in early 1982 at the start. Note the fireplace. You will see this again later. The exterior stonework was repointed and the roof made watertight. Window frames were replaced and shutters made to keep out vandals. Later, as part of a community programme project, the interior was rendered and plastered. So, at the beginning of 1988, when work began on the whole site, the volunteers had a sound building for use as a mess room and storage of equipment. Alongside this building, the foundations were dug out for a toilet and washroom block. Over the ensuing months, it took shape. Notice the smart sign that has appeared on the original building. To mark the start of track laying at Darley-Dale, local civic personalities were invited to wield a ceremonial shovel. And so work began. Piles of ballast appeared. And the first item of rolling stock arrived. A very good vantage point is the Warney Lane Bridge. First, a view in early 1988. Later that year, the coach can be seen standing on the track with ballast piled in the foreground. But it was in the early months of 1989 that things really began to hum. A view from the bridge in February 1989 reveals an amazing sight. Not just one small length of track, but 3, together with turnouts and points. Going down to track level, we find the lads hard at work. Staying at track level, we will go back to the previous summer of 1988. Looking south through the Warney Lane Bridge, the track bed beyond is wilderness. But once again, in February 1989, the view through the same bridge. The track bed ballasted as far as the eye can see, and sleepers in position. And 1 month later, climbing back onto the bridge and looking south, track disappears round the bend. Later in the year, a works train rolls along in the spring sunshine as the line gets further south. By now, it's a long walk to the working point for those who miss the train. In the autumn of 1989, a base was repaired at the end of the platform alongside the road. Then, on the last day of September, 2 low loaders made their way through the heart of the Peak District, carrying the signal box from Bamford on the Hope Valley line to Darley-Dale. First, the bottom half was lowered onto the prepared base. Then the top, with the skill of the crane driver and gentle tugging on ropes from peak rail workers on the ground. The 2 halves slowly came back together. Into 1990, and work continued steadily. This bridge just north of Matlock was restored, and the track continued to creep slowly southwards towards Matlock. Various items of line-side machinery and signs appeared. In early spring, some track was laid on the northern side of the road at Darley-Dale. Then these signs appeared. The County Council agreed to the closure of Station Road for 2 weeks to enable peak rail workers to reinstate the level crossing. This was week 1. Week 2 saw track laid across the road. This was the view from the signal box onto the double track crossing the road. Then, a special moment. The first train for 22 years crossed Station Road. During the summer of 1990, visitors to Darley-Dale saw a train standing in the station, apparently ready to depart for Matlock. Work on coach restoration got underway. In the spring of 1991, 4 very large holes appeared on either side of the road. These were ready for the posts to support the crossing gates, which were put in place a few weeks later. Now things really begin to look like a working railway. One peak rail worker is a gardener. He set about the task of recreating the station garden from apparent wilderness. Judging by this picture taken in late spring of 1992, he is making a blooming good job. In the latter part of 1991, the larger room at Darley-Dale Station was prepared to become a shop and buffet. This duly opened in late November. So the stage was set. In mid-December, 2 pieces of good news were received: the granting of the light railway order and permission from the local authority to operate trains. On a very foggy Saturday, the 14th of December, the day of the annual general meeting, members, shareholders and other well-wishers saw the first passenger train leave Darley-Dale for the 2-mile journey to Bridge 38 and return. During the first months of 1992, the push-pull operation continued at weekends, while both peak rail workers and contractors worked hard to get the Corder Bridge and the new platform at Matlock ready for use at Easter. The deadline was achieved. On Easter Saturday, the trains were pulled, not pushed, out of Darley-Dale for the full journey to Matlock. There, a smart new station called Matlock Riverside was waiting. The loco then ran around the train for the return journey to Darley-Dale. Passengers travel in comfortable coaches. Weekend motorists on the A6, possibly stuck in a traffic jam north of Matlock, will see this superb sight of the peak rail train. So in the spring of 1992, Peak Rail is looking forward with confidence. After watching this presentation, you must be asking how the company intends to achieve its objectives, particularly regarding finance and manpower. In the finance field, further share issues are planned, and other monies will be raised by commercial borrowing, grants from public and private sources, and fundraising by members. The line will be rebuilt and operated by a combination of civil engineering contractors, full and part-time staff, volunteers, plus any help from government schemes that may be available. Peak Rail has already got many of the professional skills required at either director or officer level. However, one asset that will always be needed is new members. They can provide labour, assist in fundraising, and are the outward and visible sign of public support for the project. So, although you may have questions to ask of us, we will now ask one of you. Why don't you become a member of Peak Rail? If you still have any doubts about the future of our project, we ask you to consider the next 3 slides. The first, a view looking south from Darley-Dale Crossing in the early 60s, when the line was still operated by British Rail. Use the tall building on the right as your landmark. The same view in 1981, a sad, sorry sight. But in 1992, the railway lives again. There is still a lot more work to be done. The next stage will be northwards from Darley-Dale towards Roseley. Your help is needed now.